Hi, everyone, and welcome to Night School. I'm Lynn.
And I'm Christina. Good evening.
Good evening. Christina, Tom is asking how you are doing.
Ha! I'm great. And Sharon too, thank you. Yeah, I told people watching last week that this tonight is actually going to be my last show for a while since I'm going to have a baby very soon. So yeah, so thank you for asking. And also, hello. This is also, sorry, this is like getting personal already, but hello to my Aunt Lisbeth, who's in Melbourne. She's watching. What a surprise. Very nice to have you here.
It's a special night.
Yeah.
Okay, back to the program. So Christina and I are part of the Nightlife team at Cal Academy in San Francisco. Nightlife is our weekly Thursday night events where we mix science with cocktails, live music, and more. We are now officially back in the building on select Thursdays, so come by if you get a chance. We are still bringing you Night School. Night School is our virtual version where Christina and I get to bring a little nightlife back home to all of you. Tonight, we're going down under, exploring some of the unique wildlife and ecosystems of Australia. And we're super excited for tonight's theme. We've been wanting to do this theme for a while, and since tonight is Christina's last episode for a while, we thought tonight would be a good night to do so. So Christina, do you want to tell us about the program?
Yes, happily. So first up, we have Dr. David Hughes, who is an expert in the biomechanics of animal locomotion, and his lab at Georgia Tech recently won an Ig Nobel Prize in physics for explaining a phenomenon that you probably wondered about forever if you knew that wombats make cube-shaped poops. If you didn't know that, your mind was just blown, and now it's going to be blown again when he explains exactly how they do that. So he's up first. Then next up, we have Doug Gimesy, a conservation and wildlife photojournalist who doesn't have to travel far from home to find interesting conservation stories. It helps that his home is in southeastern Australia. So he's worked with Nat Geo, Audubon, BBC Wildlife, and the Academy's own biographic publication and big picture competition. And he'll talk about two of his favorite animals that he's covered close to his hometown of Melbourne: flying foxes and platypuses. And last but not least, I had the chance to talk to Dr. Christine Hosking, conservation planner at the University of Queensland, about the koala population's plummeting numbers amid the recent bushfires, drought, and increased urban development that threatens them. Also, any guesses to how long koalas have been around on this planet? Because the answer surprised me. So she'll talk about that too. So.
Yes. And then Christina surprised me with the same answer. As always, tonight's program is live. So say hi, let us know where you're watching from. Let us know if it's your first time joining or your night school regular. Also, let us know how much you'll miss Christina in the next few months. We'll have a couple Q&A, so make sure to get your questions in the chat or comment box. And now we are going to turn it over to David, who is in a very fun outfit.
What's up, Night School? This is David Hu. I'm coming to you from Atlanta. It's 10 p.m. on a Thursday night, and I'm wearing my wombat poop costume to tell you about the physics of wombat poop. This is what you see in front of you. Not me, but the thing on the rock. That's what you find produced by wombats, and the rock is important. So that'll come back in a little bit. So the biggest question I get is, why are you studying wombat poop of all the different things out there? And one of the reasons is that for years, physicians have used the size and shape of your feces as a sign of your colorectal health. Some of you might have heard of this famous Bristol stool chart that rates your feces type from a type 1, which is hard like nuts, you don't want that type, to a type 7, which is pretty much all liquid water, and to everything in between, including the poetic smooth, soft sausage or snake. Now, the fact that the wombats make cubic poop and basically angular regions of their feces tells you something special is going on in the intestine, and might one day be able to be used by physicians to detect things like colon cancer. Colon cancer, for example, is a phenomenon where parts of your colon actually get stiffer, and that can affect your poop shape. So keep that in mind as we go forward, that one day this might actually influence how doctors diagnose you based on your poop shape. Now, if you're an engineer, you might think of cubes and the built world. And the reason why wombat cubic poop are so rare and so amazing is that cubes are just so rare in nature. If you look around your house for cubic things, like for example here, this is my charger for my PC here. They're usually made by a couple different processes. That is totally different from how the wombat do it. Oh yeah, dinner topic. Yeah, some of you are enjoying dinner right now, 7 p.m.ers. For example, the dice that you see or any plastic devices, those are usually made by a process of extrusion and heating. So they basically release this sort of hot plastic into this mold, and the mold will form around the plastic and basically give it its shape as it solidifies. The other method is something you might be familiar with. This is how you make spaghetti. If you've got a soft sort of material, you can extrude it by pushing it through a hard die. And that causes the soft material to take the form of the die as it's squeezed out. That's done with these hay cubes. And we'll test that with the wombat by looking very carefully at its anus. The last method is using very sharp tools to basically spin away, cut away at hard materials. And as we see, wombat poop is too soft for that method to work, and wombats don't have saws in their butts. So if you haven't seen a wombat poop, I'm going to give you a full 3D picture here. Now I'm going to spin around, and that thing spin around. Yeah, there we go. So this is actually a 3D scan of a wombat poop in our lab. If you're out of dice and you're in Australia, you can just paint a couple 1s and 6s on there, and you can flip this thing, decide who does chores. You can see clearly it has 6 sides and 8 edges, just like a cube should. Now, it's not a perfect cube. In fact, throughout this talk, I'll be calling it a cube, but it's actually a cuboid, which means that the edges are rounded. They're not perfectly angular. The die is cast. Yes, it is. Now, we were fortunate enough to work with a great collaborator, Scott Carver, who studies mange, this disease that wombats transfer. He lives in Tasmania, and when he goes hunting for wombats, he basically goes around with these nets, and they, as you can see, they run very, very quickly. There it is. And imagine they're about the size, let's show that one more time. They're about the size of a toddler. They're about 30 kilograms, but they're almost completely muscle. So they really run quite quickly. They're very, very hard to catch. So for the wombats we actually found here, these unfortunately are killed by cars on a regular basis. So I'll be showing you some of those poor wombats. The wombats are amazing because they're pretty much the world's second most cutest animal, according to lots of surveys. This is them emerging out of their underground burrows. So they're highly drought tolerant. They feed on basically these dry grasses, and they have these 15, 20-meter long burrows that they spend their lives digging and burrowing out. There's one with Joey with its mother. And one of the amazing things about wombats is that their bodies have totally evolved for their digging purposes. So like other marsupials, wombats have pockets, places where they store their joeys. But the pockets in wombats have actually flipped towards their butt end. And that's to prevent them basically filling their pockets with dirt every time they dig. But unfortunately, as you see, if you're a baby wombat, you get pooped on a daily basis. In fact, about 100 times a day. So 100 times a day, they'll generate these cubic feces. Now, some of you might be wondering, what's the name of the animal? It's called a wombat. A wombat. So biologically, if there's 8,000 species of mammals in the world, why do we only have a single one that makes cubic feces? That has to do with the special conditions that these wombats evolved in. So like I said, the wombats live most of the hot days in the underground burrows. They emerge, and they're quite territorial. They don't spend very much time with each other. And in fact, to mark their territories, they use their feces, like many other animals. The feces have a particular chemical scent and a certain shape. And to make their feces the most prominent, they put them on basically the tallest outcroppings they can, the tallest logs and rocks, which is usually like a short stump or this fallen log here, to sort of really act as a flag, as a physical cairn, of wombat poops. Now, if you consider the first wombat millions of years ago, it probably laid a poop there, and because it was cylindrical, it just rolled off the platform. And that was unfortunate because it didn't act as a good marker. So what we think is that what happened is that over generations and generations, the wombat's intestines learned to sculpt the poop so it was more steadfast as it was laid on the rock. And if you want to be basically hold stationary, you want to have something with flat faces. There's 3 species of wombats. The ones I'll talk about are called the bare-nosed wombat, which pretty much people call wombats. But hairy-nosed wombats, as you see in the bottom right, these actually do not have as cubic feces. So it's really unique to this one species of wombat. So I talked about how we make cubes in the man-made world. So the extrusion, the molding, the cutting. Let's see if wombats actually do that. So I'm going to show you first time over at NightSchool, California Academy of Sciences, a CT scan of a wombat's anus. So imagine you're sort of walking through the wombat from the head to the tail. That's what you see. So I'll play this a few times here. You basically start, and that's its digestive system. And as it gets smaller and smaller, here. That's its stubby little legs. And right before it ends, you see its anus isn't particularly cube-shaped. It's sort of round, just like ours. And it's also very soft. So in other words, they don't make poop the way we make spaghetti. It's not a process of extrusion. So what is the process? Well, to study this, we actually had Scott Carver actually mailed us wombat intestines and poop to Atlanta, Georgia, where he had dissected them after they had been unfortunately hit by cars. And this is a view into Scott Carver's life. So this is his this is his dissection room. This is the poor wombat that just died a few hours earlier from a car crash. As I said, it's 30 kilograms, but its intestines are 10 meters long, 30 feet long intestines. That could wrap around the room I'm sitting in. That's the same length of intestines as your own. And as you would expect, near the stomach, it's basically full of sort of a wet slurry, grass mixed with digestive juices. In fact, it's pretty much the same color as the grass, sort of this yellowish green. And then over basically a couple 20 feet, it gets drier, and that's what happens in our intestines as well. Until the very last 20%, it's completely cubified. So it goes from sort of a wet slurry to getting cracks and drier, and then it changes color and develops these hard edges and flat faces. So I saw this. It was amazing to me because it showed that the wombat formed the cubes inside its body. And it's a very different process than the way we make cubes in the built world. I had a hunch of how they were built. One thing when we looked at them, I saw the cubes were very, very similar in shape. And I was thinking of basically if you had a bunch of rocks in a sock and they were all just jiggling all over the place, they would eventually kind of get round. So the only hope the wombat has of making these things have strict shapes is by orienting them. And that means the wombat's got to have sort of a map, sort of a coordinate system in its intestines that says corner 1 goes here, corner 2 goes here, corner 3 goes here. So to figure out how that map happens in the wombat, this is around Christmas time, we decided to hang the wombat intestines from my lab vertically from the ceiling. And as they swung back and forth like mistletoe, they eventually came to a halt, and I saw that the corners of these cubes were aligned. That means the intestines has a plan for where the corners are going to be. Here's an animation from NHK that kind of gives you an idea of the three-dimensionality of this process. We've got the wombat intestines, and like most animals' feces are circular. And the reason for that is that intestines want to minimize their surface area. They want to minimize the amount of material used. So you basically want to have a circular cross-section. But the wombats have what we discovered are 2 long bands of stiff regions. Imagine if you had a calamari and you basically preferentially made 2 regions of those really stiff and chewy, and the other ones nice and soft. And that's what we discovered the wombat has. Over the basically 5 days, 3 to 5 days, the wombat's feces are in its intestine. It does these contractions, about 40,000 contractions over that cycle. And over this time, these stiff regions preferentially will help sculpt the corners in a process I'll show you in a second. In another paper we're writing, we're talking about the remaining corners, like how they get the flat faces in between. That has to do with a process of drying. It's similar to how you get these hexagonal rocks that are found in places like Giant Causeway, Ireland. So we discovered the stiff regions through a couple methods. One is through microscopy. We discovered that there are certain parts that are stiffer and thicker. So here's a difference in thicknesses. And we actually hung intestines and we wrote little lines on them to measure basically how much they stretched. And that's how we further confirmed that they're basically these stiff regions. So this is an example of what's happening in the wombat intestines. There's this constant, what we call peristalsis and motion of the fluid. And we were able to put the properties of the intestine. We found that they're 4 times stiffer in part of the intestine than the other. So there are these bands that are 4 times stiffer. And we were able to put that in this computer simulation where we basically imitated a contraction. And we saw that basically, as you contract, a couple of things occur. Imagine these red parts are the regions of high stiffness. Imagine you've got a muscle that's 4 times as stiff. When you do a contraction, that muscle is going to be stronger than the others. And for example, if you've got a perfect circle, it's going to basically contract faster than the other regions. So the stiff regions sort of form the corners first because they have higher strength. The remaining corners, sorry, my wombat costume is actually kind of in the way of my mouse. The remaining corners are due to the fact that you're basically farthest away from the fastest contracting regions. And when you're farthest away, you sort of get left behind. And that's how you get the remaining 2 corners. You get these 2 corners contracting first and the remaining 2 contracting last. Let's just get this one. Oops. Here's some wombat cubes we found from Australia. You can see they're quite. They also vary in cubicity quite a bit. And here's a sort of a summary of our modeling, where we basically vary the stiffness of the intestine here, and basically also vary the speed of the contractions. So our intestines actually suggest, our models actually suggest the wombat cubes should be more circular than they are. Wombat cubes are actually more like here, but the intestines are producing something like here. There's still sort of a missing link of why they're getting so much more cubic in the intestine. And that's still something we're trying to study. So if you like this talk, there's more stories like this about amazing things that animals do with physics. In my book, How to Walk on Water and Climb Up Walls, it's at Princeton Press. There's a 30% off coupon here if you use Dahoo on the code. It was published in 2018, republished in 2020, and I've been going around giving talks about it. Here I'm at Cal Academy of Sciences, then I'll be in McCary University, American Society of Biomechanics, Washington State, and then this American Physical Society and Society of Integrative and Comparative Biology. Dr. David Hu on Twitter, and happy to open the floor for any questions. Thanks a lot.
Hi, David.
Hey.
I've never stared so closely at poop, but I was quite close to all the screens. Okay, so we have time for some questions. The first one is, you mentioned it only, so cube poop only occurs in bare-nosed wombats. Why? Why is it only one species and not others?
My hypothesis that might have to do with the drying conditions. Even at zoos, they've shown that wombats in captivity, their poop is not as cubic as that in nature. I think my guess is that they're more drought tolerant than the other ones. The dryness is important because it's really needed to keep the shape. Once it becomes wet, corners, the reason why you don't see many cube-shaped rocks in nature is because they're going to hit things and get deformed. The drier it is, the more easy it is to hold those sort of strange shapes. So I'm guessing they're sort of more drought tolerant, and they don't mind the pain of a cube coming out of the anus as much as the other ones.
Did you measure the pain of the other ones too?
No, we have some videos of them pooping. We don't actually see them grimacing or anything. But the other ones are just not known for cubic feces. And I think we measured the dryness of wombat poop, and they're actually drier than human feces. I mean, feces that you and I produce is generally 80% water, but wombats are near 60%. And I'm guessing these other two wombat species are something in between.
Cool. Is it uncommon for small animals to have intestines as long as human ones?
That's a good question. There's when you get, I would say the trend is as you get smaller, your intestines probably get longer with respect to your body size because you get less and less surface area. For example, like mice and babies, anything that's small will get cold easily. And that has to do with this thing called the surface area to volume ratio. Once you get really small, you just have a really, really big surface area to volume. And I think they have to compensate for that by having sort of longer length. The reason a wombat has it, I think, is because it really is trying to get as much moisture out of the poop as possible. So it's really trying to get as much intestines as it can pack in that little body. I mean, as you saw from that poor wombat that was hit by the car, its body's like half intestines. It's really like doing a lot to extract all that water and all those nutrients from these grasses that it's eating. I think as you get smaller, I mean, humans have extraordinarily long intestines. It also depends on diet. Herbivores like cows and things like that, they have incredibly long intestines and 4 stomachs and things like that because they've got to do much more digestion. It turns out meat is a lot easier to digest than veggies. Veggies just require very, very long intestines to sort of break down all that fiber. So I think it probably has more to do with like diet than size. But I do think they have pretty long intestines for their size.
Cool. Is there any evolutionary advantage to intestinal banding?
Well, the way natural selection works, I think, is that if they got the intestinal banding, they made the feces cubic, and that helped it stay on the rocks more, and that helped it mark their territories more. So those wombats that had sort of better markers, better advertisements for their territory, got in less fights with sort of the bigger, badder wombat across the street, and also advertised their maybe sexual state and stuff like that to female wombats. So they're just better communicators. And that counterbalanced any kind of sort of cost of making these sort of bands in the intestines. So we think that's how it sort of evolved and stayed put. Because they're so territorial and their feces are so dry, it gave them kind of the perfect conditions to sort of evolve this thing. I mean, some people tell us maybe it doesn't have to do with communication at all. Maybe it has to do with the drought tolerance. For example, maybe the cubes are better a cube has more surface area than a circle, for example. Maybe that helps it extract more water so it can sort of lose less water over time. So yeah, there's interesting questions of what does the cube do besides just chemical communication.
So this is a good question that just came in. Do baby wombats have smaller cubic poop, or do they develop this ability over time?
Ooh.
Have you gotten smaller baby poops?
Let me look at this picture. Let's see. There's some variability in size. For example, maybe that upper left one was from the daddy wombat. Yeah, we never thought about that. That's a good idea. Good question. The thing is, I don't know if the baby wombats are able to get on, use these latrines as effectively as the adults. Like it takes some practice to go on top of this rock and poop it out. So I don't know. It's a good question. I'm guessing they probably do, but I don't think it serves the same purpose as the adults because they're not really responsible for the territory. Most of the poops are coming from the parents.
Cool. Okay, last question. Why did you start studying wombat poop?
This came as a question we were doing this work on physics of feces shape, and one of the audience members, their kid was reading Ranger Rick, and they said, we have a counterexample to your circular feces data, and that's his cubic poop. And before that, I'd never heard of it, but then as soon as we found it out, we knew we had to get a ticket to Australia.
Nice. Well, thank you so much, David, for joining us tonight. Christina added the link to David's book in the chat. So if you're interested, the link is in the comment box. Thanks so much, David.
Great. Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, everybody.
Up next, we'll have Doug Gimesy, who will be talking about flying foxes and platypuses.
Hi there. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm not sure how you followed David's square poops talk, but I will try. Conservation stories closer to home. About 5 years ago, I was in Botswana doing some work for Cheetah Conservation Botswana, and I was in the middle of the Kalahari Desert. And if you can see down there was a gentleman wearing a T-shirt. And as I got closer and closer, I saw that it said he was wearing a Sydney 2000s Olympic T-shirt. And I thought, what are the odds coming from Australia being in the middle of the Kalahari Desert? seeing a bushman wearing an Australian t-shirt. And I went over and had a chat to him, and he said to me, look, thanks so much for coming to Botswana to help us out with our conservation issues. You clearly, if you've traveled all this way, you don't have many conservation issues yourself. And that started me thinking, with Australia having one of the worst species extinction records in the world, that maybe I should work closer to home. And also at that time, Melbourne was ranked the world's most livable city. And my partner said to me, livable city for what? It's not the wildlife. So about 5 years ago, I decided that I should really focus my work and my conservation closer to home. And I set myself a challenge to do that close to Melbourne, but also close to a river we have called the Yarra River. Now, there's a species I'm not going to talk about today, but I will put up the photo because everyone seems to like it, and that are the gorgeous little penguins of Melbourne, which have something to do with the Yarra River as well. And again, these are 5 kilometres from my home in Melbourne. But 2 species I do want to talk about, and I saw that Sharon Baker, I think, said in the link, she said platypi. It's actually platypuses because it's not Latin, it's Greek derivative. And one is looking for footprints in water, which is a photo story I've been working on for the last few years. And for those who love the platypus, I've been really fortunate to get very, very close with them in the field. And one of the challenges, if you don't know the distribution of platypus, basically they exist all along the east coast in Australia down to Tasmania and on an island in between. And starting to do this, I was made aware of a newspaper report in 1913, so a bit over 100 years ago, which said 22 platypuses were caught in the Yarra in the Yarra River near Prince's Bridge, which is basically the middle of the city. And platypuses haven't been seen there for 30 or 40 years. And this, I guess, is a highlight of the challenges they are under, and something I wanted to cover. You know, how do we know how many platypuses there are? Because they're quite hard to find in the wild, even if you know where they are. For those of you who know Victoria, our hometown, Melbourne, there, we have a very large bay. And looking at around this area, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. This is what was thought to be the distribution of platypus over 100 years ago. So that would be Melbourne there, that's the bay. And of course, they live up these rivers and then all the way up the east coast. Of course, since colonisation a couple of 100 years ago, the challenges we have been negatively impacting everything. Habitat destruction, what we call development and fires, predation, changing river flows from droughts to floods, getting caught in inappropriate fishing nets, physical pollution, hair ties, rubber bands take an awful toll. They'll nuzzle through and they'll get them stuck around their neck. It's awful, and localized extinction events. But one of the challenges with platypuses is that we haven't until recently really known their full distribution, because they are so elusive. If you see one in the wild and you get reasonably close, or they hear you, they will dive underwater. So this one photo story I wanted to do was, how do we find out how many platypuses there are, to know their extent throughout the regions? And the old way to do it was really, really labor intensive. What researchers would do, as my good friend Josh there, would set up these nets in these small rivers. They would go out and check at night. You would then, if you were lucky, you would find a platypus, you would take it back to the car where you'd weigh it, you'd measure it, you might take a DNA sample, a skin sample, then you'd head back to the river, maybe give it a bit of a cuddle on the way back, and then basically return it back to the river. You might get 4 or 5 platypuses doing this at night, but incredibly labor intensive. But with the development of DNA, and all of you who've watched CSI, the great thing about aquatic animals, especially in rivers, is they shed DNA. And you don't physically have to be where they are to collect the DNA. If they've shedded DNA up the river and you're downstream, as long as it's reasonably recent, they figure about a day or 2, you'll be able to pick up whether platypus are there. So the interesting story is the way to determine whether platypus are in rivers now is You go to the river, you draw up a water sample, you'll take it back to the lab, you'll do some interesting science stuff. I used to be a zoologist, but I don't fully understand how they do it. And then you'll look on a screen and basically you will find whether there have been platypus upstream in that river at some stage. And this is going to be rolled out in Victoria and hopefully nationally, where citizen science is going to allow everybody to go and take water samples with the right equipment, of course, and we can get a better idea of where platypus are. But coming back to the Melbourne situation, having done this and this work being done, these graphs show catch per unit area, and I know they're probably a little bit small on most people's screens, but these are the declines over time around Victoria. And the challenge has been that first graph I showed you, which is what we believe the distribution has been pre-colonisation, so basically all up through the rivers. This is what we now believe its distribution to be, with the green being quite abundant, the red virtually going extinct, and the yellow somewhere in between. So the challenge we have with the platypus, and there will be a positive side to this at the end, is that this technology is fantastic and it allows us to understand not only platypus, but a lot of freshwater wildlife, what their distribution is. But currently the platypus is not doing well, and it does worry me that for some regions, or definitely for some regions, some areas, that most people will only get the chance to see a platypus on a 20-cent piece. I'm seeing a few questions pop up, and I will answer those at the end. But another conservation story, nice and close to home, as was mentioned, is what I call the Melbourne night gardeners. Now, this type of animal has been getting a bit of a tough rap due to COVID, but I think they're one of the most magnificent mammals there are. And these are flying foxes, and we're lucky enough in Melbourne to have a colony of 50,000 during summer of grey-headed flying foxes. Again, the grey-headed flying fox species is endemic only to Australia. They exist all up and down the east coast again, and they are the most magnificent animals. If you haven't seen one in flight, this is a mum carrying their baby. Yes, they carry their babies up until about 5 or 6 weeks of age when they leave them in a creation nest. As they head out, they've got these magnificent wingspans. The grey-headed flying fox, about a metre as a wingspan. And if you want to talk about evolution, as David was talking about, you can see these are basically their wrists, their hands just here. So there's their forearm, their elbow, and this has basically been evolved over time so these mammals can fly. And you know, for me, how cool. These are flying mammals. Beautiful wings with high vasculature. You see their veins, the blood running through that. But also, you know, their wings are fantastic because they can act as raincoats during the rain. This is a rainstorm in Melbourne during a summer rainstorm. They can also act as evaporative coolers when it gets hot, so the air will blow through them and cool them down. Incredible noses. Their noses can pick smells up for about 1 kilometre away, they say, which of course allows them to pick up the fruit. Incredible evolution for their hands. And this is something I love about their evolution, is that they hang upside down all the day and they sleep upside down. And a lot of people ask, how do they not fall off? So unlike us, who have to deliberately use a muscle to contract our hands, grey-headed flying foxes actually have to use muscles to open their tendons. So when they're asleep or unconscious, they are locked onto the branch. And so if they're asleep, if it's windy, they can relax and be locked on. Whereas to let themselves go to fly, they actually have to use energy. So it's really, really energy efficient. And one of my favorite things about them as well, if they get hot and they want to cool down, they do these fantastic high-speed belly dips, which is this is at the Yarra that I was talking about before, the river near Melbourne. This is about 5 kilometres from city centre. So they'll do these high-speed dips. They'll hit their chests in, they'll take off, and then from there they'll fly back to the tree. They'll hang upside down, and the water will dribble down their chest into their mouth. And again, they'll also get cool. But again, during or because of colonisation, grey-headed flying fox has been under awful decline. It's estimated there are about 10 million of them. However, now 500 600,000. And one of the challenges they have, and I think I'm one of the luckiest people in the world to live in Melbourne because I get to see this in summer. We get to see up to 50,000 grey-headed flying foxes travel out over Melbourne at night, every night over summer. Why do they go out? Well, grey-headed flying foxes are vegetarians, and they go out to feed on the nectar of eucalyptus trees, also eat native seeds. And this is really, really important for pollination. They are probably more important than bees in regards to pollination. They're long distance pollinators and seed dispersers. They can fly up to 2,000 or 3,000 kilometers a year, maybe 40 or 50 kilometers a night. But the challenge is as you head out in an urban environment, you face threats. One is electric power lines. Because of their magnificent wingspan, if they touch two of those, they can get electrocuted. Another is fruit tree netting. Of course, they will fly in to where the fruit is if we have native fruits or pollinating plants, and people put inappropriate fruit tree netting on and they get caught. And it's brutal to their wings. It damages their wings and they just can't get out. And of course, the other thing is barbed wire, especially that around trees, because they can't see it at night. That's the sad part to it. The positive is there's people out there trying to save them. There are people out there rescuing them at night. During the day, they will collect these magnificent mammals. This is Bev and Paul, friends of mine. They will look after these young ones, grow them up in the home, look after their home as they grow up. They will look after premature ones. They will look after them in their homes, feed them. And then eventually as they get older, they will put them into a larger enclosure. We'll feed them watermelon and fruits and eventually take them to a halfway home in the park to where their colony is in Melbourne, and eventually release them. And they go back to the colony. And this helps a small number, but it's really, really important because what's happening. But another threat that's hitting the flying fox, and actually not only the grey-headers, but a lot, is the impact of climate change and what is known as heat stress events. And grey-headed flying foxes are really, really vulnerable to it because they use so much energy they need to fly. When we get these really, really hot days, they literally can fall from the sky. Another thing that they can do, and this is really sad to see, is it's what's known as clumping. A lot of people have seen this photo in National Geographic, and people go, oh heavens, that's such a cute photo. But it's actually, it might be technically a nice photo, but it's an awful thing to see because what has happened here is it's been so hot that the grey-headed flying foxes have done what they normally wouldn't do, and that is come down from the trees to try and get out of the hot wind and the hot sun. And sadly, and ironically, they get close together, and they get so close together, they start overheating, and then they fall to the ground and die. When this photo was taken, 10% of the population died from heat stress, which was just awful. But of course, again, there are people out there to try and help. Sadly, this flying fox had been so sunburnt, I guess, that its wings had popped like a balloon. And as I mentioned, during that year in 2019, which was when our bushfires started, about 10% of the population was killed. But again, there's always people out there to help, which is why a lot of my photos include people, because we know people cause issues, people can solve issues. And so just before Christmas, we had the Melbourne Fire Brigade out there in their fire truck, which is covered with decorations, spraying down the colony, keeping it cool. We had people out there with fire pumps, spraying them down to keep them cool. We had people out there collecting them. As my friend Kate, giving them fluids if they could, and then people, of course, looking after them in cages. So all these things, all these images taken within about 15 kilometers, so let's say 10 miles from my home. And I mentioned, I was focusing on conservation stories closer to home, but there's a couple of great things about doing conservation stories closer to home as well. And for me, it allows the time for the important moments. So the weather, I can shoot summer, winter, spring, autumn. I can go out and it's only 5 or 10 kilometers away. Doesn't matter on the season, I can take multiple attempts. Also allows the ability to build relationships, because a lot of my photography, I have to get access to restricted areas, or people need to trust me to go into these areas, or into people's homes, and they'll trust me and allow me to spend a day having a cup of tea with them. And I'll just watch what they do and talk to them. And as they do what they do, I'll pick up the camera and take a photo. Because of the type of photography I do, I don't stage things. It's very much photojournalism. But if I can spend a day or 2 or 3 days in someone's house as they go around looking after wildlife, it allows me to do that. And of course, it's cheaper from a travel, accommodation and environmental impacts. But for all the work I do, these are, I guess, tactical benefits. If my images can't help make a difference, then to me, they're a little bit of a waste. So what has been great about doing conservation stories closer to home, I've been lucky enough to have my pieces published in National Geographic and BBC, on the television, in magazines as well. But they've also been able to be used to make policy changes. And part of that's through education, part of it's being put into policy documents. So 3 things that have happened is we've now got sprinklers in some of the trees where the grey-headed flying foxes. And of course, this is just not my work, it's lots of work of other people, but these can be added to tell the story. In local councils now, barbed wire is being taken down unless it's absolutely necessary, because 3-strand barbed wire really doesn't prevent burglars. If they want to break in, they will. 1 strand maybe. And I'm pleased to say from September this year, this type of fruit tree netting is being banned. Some blatant self-promotion as well. We've been able to do a children's book called Life Upside Down, because I really believe that if we can get children to fall in love with wildlife and the environment, they are the future, and they will make a difference. And so that's been an incredible success. And then on the platypus side, there's now a national campaign, and these are up in billboards, to talk about how the platypus is threatened. We've been able to get these awful type of nets that can catch 3 to 5 platypus and drown them. They are now banned. And in my home state of Victoria, recently, the data which I was talking about before with Josh and the eDNA data has now shown that the platypus is vulnerable and declining, which is really, really sad, of course. But there are now new, stronger laws put in place to protect them, and hopefully those laws will be expanded to protect the habitat, because one of the biggest weaknesses with most environmental laws, if you look after trying to protect a species, if you don't protect its habitat, that's a little bit mute. So there's just 2 conservation stories closer to home, plus the penguin one. So I'll pitch it open to if anyone has any questions. I saw lots pop up, but I'll try and answer those I can.
Hey, Doug, thanks so much.
Pleasure.
Yeah, let's start on some of those questions. I think people have some questions about the platypus. It's a remarkably strange animal, right? So, what is the origin? What animal are they related to? What's their closest relative?
Wow, that is a good question. I know that there are fossil records going back to 60 million years in South America. Okay. So platypuses are what's known as a monotreme. What's evolutionarily related to them means egg laying, and it's basically the echidna, because they lay eggs as well. But going back past 60 million years, I can tell you it's a mammal. And then from that, one of the 3 types, so what Dave was talking about before was, we basically have those who give birth to fully formed large young, which are us, the eutherians, horses, dogs, fully formed. It will look like you or I, but a smaller version, or the parent. Then the marsupials that are very underdeveloped and live in a pouch. And then, of course, the platypus and the echidnas, which are give birth to eggs and then suckle from there. But going back past 60 million years, I'm not sure.
Yeah. And then can platypuses be dangerous? Do the scientists have to be careful when handling them?
The mature males have a spur on the back on their back leg, and that can be painful. They say it's one of the most painful injuries you can get. There's been some recorded cases where someone got spurred, and the only thing that would stop the pain was a neural block. Like the morphine didn't touch it. So there's actually been some work being done to figure out what makes it so incredibly painful, because it's nearly a reptilian venom. And the interesting thing is they can figure out what makes it so painful. They might be able to figure out what can be one of the most incredible painkillers, because there is virtually nothing that can touch it for if you get spurred. So they'll always pick a platypus up by the tail, and then if it's a male, you'll always hold it by the tail, and if it's a female, you can give it a bit of you can hold it differently, but it is brutally painful.
A bit of a cuddle.
Yeah.
And and then this is just my question, because I kind of missed it. So you're talking about this great like community science work where people might be able to go take their own water samples. What exactly is in the water that indicates that platypuses have been there?
Just part of their DNA. They shed
just
DNA.
Okay.
Like you could tell if people had been there, a fish had been there. You basically know certain unique segments of the platypus DNA, and it will just flush down. So if you think CSI, literally, where they'll go into in a crime scene, they'll swab where the person has been standing. Well, for aquatic animals that are in rivers, it's just flowing down, and it can pick up really, really small parts. And the technology is getting much, much more accurate. Now, the accuracy of picking it up will depend on how fast the river's flowing, how many platypuses are upstream, how far from downstream. But they've shown it's about as accurate as going out and setting nets, because you'll sometimes set a net and a platypus won't come out of its burrow, or might go over or under or around. So as far as picking it up, it's about the same, but it's basically a small fragment of platypus-specific DNA.
Cool. Great. And then switching over to flying foxes, which are bats, correct?
They are a fruit bat.
Okay. Fruit bats.
There's been a change in terminology, but normally we talk about megabats, which are the big bats, which are virtually all vegetarian, so fruit. And then and they're out during the day, and then the microbats, where people in the States will be much more familiar with, live under bridges and in dark places, and they eat insects, and they're carnivores or insectivores.
Okay, great. So that's good. We have that down. So Autumn wants to ask, how long did you spend working on the fruit bat story? And did you have a writer and collaborator from the start?
No. Okay. How long? I'm still doing it. So I started maybe 3 or 4 years ago, because it's so close to home. If I think, it's going to be great weather to do this, or I hear of something. But to get my first story out probably took about 1.5 years, but that doesn't mean 1.5 years in the field. But that photo you see of the fruit bat licking the pollen, that photo took me 1 year, but really only took me an hour. And the reason it took me 1 year was because I had eucalyptus trees that were red, and I had a photo of a fruit bat licking a red eucalyptus pollen, but you couldn't see his or her tongue because it was a red tongue on red pollen. And I thought, well, that's just not going to show the story. So I had to wait for another season for the white eucalyptus pollen or the white flowering to come out. So and sometimes photos can take, so the penguin photo was 120 hours. So it was 30 nights, 3 hours a night, 3 to 4 hours a night. Not every night. It would be when the moon was in the right position and it was calm, and I would go and sit and wait. So that's 120 hours. Whereas that one of the mother with the grey-headed flying fox hanging on, 10 minutes. And I've been trying to take a better photo, and I'll probably spend another 30 hours trying to take a better photo. But I was there, it flew past, I went bang, 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 bang with my camera. I thought, good heavens, I've taken it. And I've tried to get better, and I haven't, but that was 10 minutes. So so the individual photos can be from 10 minutes to 120 hours. Stories can take from 1 year to, well, I'm still working on them. But again, it's not a full year. It's not like the gentlemen, or the men and women who go out and do snow leopards and wait for 50 days in a hide. I will go out. It's raining at the moment in Melbourne. It's about lunchtime. If I wanted to take flying fox photos, I probably wouldn't go out because it's winter, whereas I might in 6 months. So I have a bit of luxury. But, a couple of years, I guess, to build the relationships as well. That's really important because a lot of my photos have people. So I need time for people to learn to trust me. And I did notice someone asked me, do they have rabies? They can carry ilicivirus. It's really, really low. It's 1%, but I'm vaccinated. That took me 2 months to get vaccinated. I mean, to go through the full course of vaccinations.
Yeah. And then somebody asked, do flying foxes even eat snails? Which is no, because they're vegetarian, right? But somebody asked, did you mention something about how they could pick up snails and fly with them? Why would they do that?
Did I say
Did you
snail?
mention anything?
Did I say snail?
I don't know. What did he say?
That could be my Australian accent. They pick up their young.
No.
They pick up their small, and they carry their small. They're small, and I don't think if I lost that. No, they don't pick up snails. They seeds. No, it would be seeds. Maybe it was, so they will eat fruit, and sometimes they'll eat fruit whole, and then they will fly 40 kilometers, and they'll poop it out. So back to poop, and so they're great seed dispersers. So that's seed, not snails. Okay,
and generally, you said they lost 10% of the population in 2019. How big is the population size of the flying foxes and also of platypuses?
Yeah, okay. Of that colony in Melbourne, that was 10% of that.
The Melbourne.
Melbourne. To give you an idea of how brutal heat stress events can be, we have another native species called the spectacled flying foxes. I so recommend people Google it. I've never taken a photo. It's up north. They're the gorgeous of the gorgeous. They look like they're wearing glasses. 30% of that species died in a week, the whole species, because of a heat stress event. So to grey-headed flying foxes, the numbers vary, but they believe between 500 to 700,000, which can sound like a lot, but not when it's over. If you think 500, 700,000 people when there used to be 10 million, that's not a lot. As far as platypuses, we're still not sure. Estimates have thrown up around 50,000, but this new research is really trying to get a better idea because we don't know. I mean, the thing we do know is they're desperately under threat because think of Australia, droughts and floods, they only exist in rivers. And if you think of how they're connected all up and down the east coast, think of it like a roadwork. You put a break in a road, that population is now split. Put another break in the road, that population, and it's split forever because people will put dams and draw water out and trees will fall. So we are, what one of the probably world's top platypus experts say, it's death by 1,000 cuts. Because and it is probably for most freshwater aquatic life where we start impacting freshwater habitats.
And then finally, David who had a question. He asked about that picture of the flying foxes. Do they clump together for warmth or safety? If it's so hot, I would think they might split up.
Yeah, no. So the reason that they're clumping is because when it's really, really hot, the wind will get these reversed to the States, I guess. We'll get these brutal northerly winds and they'll be in the sun. And so they will do what you and I would do, and they will move to get out of the sun and get out of the wind. But the trees they're on, one will go there and, I'm not anthropomorphizing, but, the other ones will probably go, that looks like a great spot. And so they all start clumping, but that becomes a problem. It's a negative feedback loop because they're out of the wind, but as they get closer together, they get hot. And then what can happen is they get exhausted and they can't fly to, cool down because that's counter-evolutionary and counterintuitive. And what can happen is if one of those flying foxes falls, if you think of rock climbers, it'll knock the others down and they'll fall to the ground. And the problem with flying foxes is they can't take off from the ground, and that's why they hang. And so they, like hang gliders, they need a drop to get enough velocity to fly. So once they're on the ground, they smother each other. And I don't show these photos very often, but where I was standing, there was a pile of maybe a foot of them all on top of each other. It's like a stampede, and they were trying to get out and they were exhausted and suffocating each other and heat stressing each other, which is why the rescuers go in and tease them apart and open them. But clumping is good for one or two, but I guess it's like any stampede. If one or two people are running away from danger, that's a good thing. When you get thousands, you get people tripping and falling, and it becomes a negative feedback loop. So clumping is a bad thing to see, even though it makes a wonderful photo.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. This is wonderful. Everyone, I encourage you to go Google Doug, look at more of his photos. Yeah, thanks so much.
No, my pleasure. Thanks, Christine.
Bye. Okay, up next, you're going to see me again, but like with a slightly different background, because we had to pre-record our next talk with Dr. Christine Hosking. So enjoy. She's going to talk about the state of koalas, which is also not a particularly happy tale or good news, but we learned a lot. So enjoy. Okay. Up next, we have Dr. Christine Hosking from the University of Queensland. Good morning to you.
Good morning and good evening to you folk over there. Thanks very much for having me on this talk about koalas. Americans have always loved koalas going back many, many years, 200 years really. And one of the reasons for that is because what a lot of people don't realise is that back in the 1930s, koalas were actually unfortunately killed for their fur, in the millions in fact. And their fur was exported to Europe and to America. And America was a big customer of our fur coats. But then apparently when Americans realised that this lovely fur was actually coming from the cute little cuddly koalas, they were horrified. And America actually banned the import of koala fur and even started up a koala protection law. So in actual fact, koalas were protected under law in America before they were in Australia. So that's something that a lot of people don't realise, even Australians don't realise. Now, since that time, the fur trade did get stopped, and but koala populations to this day never really recovered from that. They've remained, they were hunted to extinction, in fact, in some of the southern parts of eastern Australia. And so now we have only smaller populations with not very good genetic diversity as a result of that. And in fact, there's a place, there are some islands where a few people in southern Australia realised they were killing them all and said, gosh, let's rescue half a dozen and pop them on an island. It's called Kangaroo Island. It's a very beautiful place off the south of Australia. And so those koalas then bred rapidly because it was a really good place for them, good food. But they were very genetically inbred because of that. And then they overpopulated that island. So since then, they've been getting translocated back to the mainland and put back on islands. So there's a lot of inherited problems with koala management going right back to when the Europeans first took over Australia and messed about with everything. This is just a photo of what some of that early original koala habitat would have looked like before we had houses and roads. It would have just been, creek lines, a lot of river red gum. Eucalyptus cameldulensis is one of the favoured koala food trees, particularly out of the cities in the country. In the countryside, the trees get a lot of moisture from the creeks and rivers. And koalas need, they don't drink water generally, and they have to get all their moisture from the leaves of the eucalypts. So it was very important for them to have healthy eucalypt trees. And then as time's gone on, of course, that situation has changed. But I'll talk about that with climate change.
Christine, is eucalyptus the only thing that koalas eat, or just most of what they eat?
No, it actually is pretty much 99% all they eat, and this is the problem. And there's about 700 different species of eucalypt trees in Australia, but koalas only like eating about 150 of them. So they're really specialised feeders. They're very, very fussy. And this is because they have to get all their nutrition from those eucalypts. So, yeah, it's very difficult. It is only occasionally they'll browse, what we call browse on other trees that are related to eucalypts in the family Myrtaceae. But it's not really their preferred food at all. They'll sit in those for shade and browse a little bit on them. But they're not really their prime food. And that's one of the problems. Koalas haven't been able to vary their diet at all. They're just stuck with gum trees.
Yeah.
So this is a typical distribution on the right, that map of where koala fossils were found. And we're talking millions. Some of these fossils go back 30 plus million years. So they're really, really ancient species that are around, well, you know, with the dinosaurs and really old. And on the left is a photo of a typical cave that we tend to stumble upon koala fossils in. These sort of limestone caves, or sometimes if there's an excavation into a hillside and it exposes some ancient rock, some of their teeth, often it's only a few teeth in their jaw that tend to be left. But it's quite amazing what scientists can find from a jaw. They can discover what food they eat because of the wear on the molar teeth and the shape of the molars and how they slice through the leaf. So it's amazing what we can find, and the size of the koalas. So we've also, or the paleontologists have discovered that some of these koalas were huge, really big, like 3 times bigger than the ones we see today.
Wow.
And you can tell that also from their tooth size. So the ancient history of koalas is really, really fascinating and really puts it into context when we see where they are today.
How did koala fossils, how did so many of them end up in caves? Because I'm thinking if they're mostly tree dwellers, then why are their fossils all in caves?
Good question. A lot of these caves were traps. So koalas, so there are a lot of animals that fall into these traps. And koalas do spend time on the ground as well, walking between habitats. So it's not just koala fossils they find in these caves. They tend to be rich with all sorts of species, but often they're just like a pitfall trap. So the animal has really just fallen into it. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
So on this slide now, this is where koalas are now currently found. So if you remember in that previous slide, they were distributed quite evenly around Australia. But about 15 million years ago, during the Miocene, that is when koalas, when the climate in Australia started to change and become a lot drier. So koalas really contracted. So in that previous slide, a lot of those areas more to the west and in the middle of Australia, they'd been rainforest and lush and very moist. But then from about 15 million years ago, the climate really started to get hotter and drier. And that's when the vegetation changed. So back then also, we know that koalas did eat things other than eucalypts, some rainforest species, for instance. But as all those rainforests dried, the koalas had to really evolve and adapt to eucalypt gum trees, which is what ended up becoming the dominant vegetation in Australia, a drier, more resilient, tougher type of vegetation. So if they were going to survive, the koalas, but again, they had millennia to make this adaptation. They didn't have to do it in a couple of hundred years. They've had millions of years to gradually change and evolve to having gum trees as their diet. So now we can see they're only on the right-hand eastern side of Australia, and yep.
Oh yeah, just is there a reason? I might have missed this, but is there a reason why they've all gone to the eastern side? Did the eastern side stay cooler, or what happened in the landscape?
So there are a couple of reasons. One is, yes, the eastern side does tend to be cooler and have better rainfall, but you're quite right. There's a bit of a mystery about why they did disappear from some of those western regions. Some in the middle, it's because it has become desert. Mm-hmm. But on the west coast, where it's also moist and wet, we don't really know. But there was the last ice age that ended about 18,000 years ago. They could have dropped off then for some reason, but there are a lot of questions that are really still unknown. But it could be the last ice age made a difference, and some of them didn't survive that ice age. Whereas on the east coast, we have modelled what the climate for koalas would have been like, and there were certainly some pockets on the east side where their range really shrank, and they just hung in there until the weather warmed up again, and then as trees came back, they expanded their ranges again. So, yeah, the fascinating thing is that these changes have all happened over such long time frames.
Okay, thanks.
Whereas now we've got a new climate happening, which everyone's very aware of. And California is certainly experiencing that, mirrored really with what we're getting down here as well, with these extreme droughts and extreme heat waves, which has led to, of course, very intense bushfires. So this is really impacting on the koalas. So not only have they got threats now from urbanisation, so on that East Coast area, it happens to also be, again, a lot of parallels with America. All the populations tend to really love being on the coast. So that's where we've had a lot of land clearing, a lot of urbanisation. And but different to America, in Australia, the middle of the country is really pretty desolate and desert and dry. So we really have people wanting to hug the coasts to live in general.
Right.
So I think 80% of the Australian population lives along those coastlines. So you can imagine the competition those poor old koalas have had for living, for where to live, because all those lovely coastal areas where the trees are better quality, where the soil tends to be good quality, that's all just made way, first of all, for farming. And then in more recent times, those farms are now converting often into suburbs. So, and the koalas have never really moved on. They're still so ancient. They haven't evolved with cars. They haven't evolved with dogs, which is another big predator. Dogs kill a lot of koalas, either wild dogs or domestic dogs. So koalas really haven't been very good at adapting to humans in the last couple of 100 years. European settlement, prior to that, of course, the Australian Aborigines were here for probably 50,000+ years, but they were in much lower numbers. They didn't have cars or roads. They would have hunted koalas very sustainably. And of course, they had so many other animals to eat as well. So it just wasn't anything like the same threats on them. And I think people feel that pretty much everything was in balance. The ecology in Australia was very much in balance with the Aboriginal people. They took what they needed, they didn't take in excess, and they lived in harmony with their environment, as is the case with Indigenous people worldwide. They lived in harmony. Yeah. So it really wasn't until 150 years ago when the settlers came along and they started cutting down all the trees and, making way for what we see today in Australia, that this damage was really done. And of course, the hunting that I mentioned earlier, that took a real toll. So on top of all those historical problems koalas have had, they're now having to deal with climate change. And so their rivers are drying up, and a lot of the trees, those river red gums I mentioned earlier, they're now suffering from dieback because they're not getting enough moisture. So a lot of the food is actually dying or becoming so dry that the koalas aren't getting enough moisture from the leaves. And that takes us to that photo on the left. And this is a koala that was just desperate for a drink. So unlike in historical times, koalas are now coming into people's swimming pools, into dog bowls, desperate to drink. They're just dehydrating. They're getting too hot. So some of the modelling we've done on the previous climate envelope for koalas shows that they would have only really lived in a maximum temperature of 37 degrees, which in Fahrenheit, you'll have to do a quick conversion.
Yeah.
Hot, but not extremely hot. 37 is pretty hot. But by comparison, these days, we're getting extended days of a week, 10 days of 45 degrees. And they cannot cope. So not only are they dehydrating, but they're often just dying from the heat. They just can't thermoregulate. So this is why we're seeing them doing bizarre things like coming into backyards for water. Cyclists are even stopping in there begging for water from the cyclists.
Yeah, and you said, and you mentioned earlier that they don't really usually drink water because they've gotten it all from the eucalyptus leaves, right? So it's really, really strange behavior.
Yeah, and really, and that alone really tells a big story. And they're wild animals that are terrified of humans. It's not like they're coming in to say, hello, I want to make friends with you. They don't want to be around people or barking dogs or cars. They're just so desperate. So, so these are the really imminent threats on koalas now. The other one, as well as the trees dying back, the dryness, is, of course, the bushfires. As you've been suffering in California, we've been getting them here. In 2019, 2020, I know it was well publicised around the world. and the awful photos of the koalas being burnt from those fires that just were huge in their expanse. They covered so many millions of hectares, and it was also prime koala bushland, unfortunately. So when I mentioned earlier, a lot of koalas have been driven away because of along the coastal strip, all that urbanisation. It's where everyone wants to live. But where there are national parks or where it's a little inland, this is often where their habitat is remaining. So, but these bushfires are now getting into those areas. So that's why we had such a catastrophic result for the koalas in those bushfire affected areas, which were in New South Wales this current time. Also Kangaroo Island, interestingly, that I mentioned earlier, down in the bottom of Australia, where all the koalas were moved to when they were all shot to extinction, basically, on that southern part of Australia. Kangaroo Island has now got still has a very healthy population of koalas, and 2/3 of that island got burnt in those same bushfires, even though it's a different state. So they got devastated down there as well. So New South Wales is further north of the country on the east coast, and Kangaroo Island's much further south. So the extent of those fires, they're cropping up in different parts of Australia, over on the west coast as well, of course, but we're not talking about that because we haven't got koalas there anymore. So a lot of koala populations got really hit by those most recent bushfires.
Are there, do people live on Kangaroo Island? Is infrastructure and roads and stuff a problem for koalas there?
Yeah, Kangaroo Island is popular with tourism, very popular in fact.
Tourism.
Especially before the bushfires, it was beautiful because a lot of it is protected. So there's a lot of natural habitat and there's fantastic wildlife on Kangaroo Island as well as koalas. So yes, it is popular, but it's not built up. It's more of it's more managed by the national parks, and it's got a much lower human footprint. And it's mainly it's in the state of South Australia, so it's a major sort of South Australian tourism destination. But not looking so great at the moment till all the trees grow back. So this next slide is some other modelling that we did so we looked at the current range of the koala, which is on that far left picture, but we modelled suitable areas of climate for koalas under the current climate, the baseline climate, though when I did this work, it was a decade ago now, so 2030 seemed a long way away then, and all of a sudden it's upon us. And these climate models I used back then have also probably got more pessimistic. So these pictures are pretty optimistic, really, because these were developed in 2012 and, climate change has continued to accelerate since then. But you'll see on that far left map, there were some dark black areas, which shows the higher probability of koalas being able to live there. This is based on climate. And you can see on the bottom west coast of Australia, it does show as being suitable for koalas. And it is where we do have a lot of those koala fossils. But that is also where, for mysterious reasons, they no longer occur. Maybe they were all, we just don't know. There are no fossils, more recent fossils over there. They're all those ancient ones, right up until about the last ice age. So it would seem that rather than humans shooting them for fur in more recent times, it would seem that it is to do with climate that they disappeared from that pocket through that ice age. But of course, as the current climate shows, they'd be fine there now. There's no talk of reintroducing them, but again, of course, that area has now become very urbanised as well. So the habitat that was there wouldn't be there anymore. So then, and then of course, on the east coast of that map under the current climate, we can see all those dark areas, which is where the koalas currently do live. So that's all correct. When we move to 2030, we can see how those areas are shifting and pretty much shrinking. That little island on the bottom is Tasmania, where I'm actually sitting at the moment, which is why I've got a woolly top on. It's a bit cool for our winter. But that shows up as very good habitat for koalas. And interestingly, we've never found any fossils for koalas in Tasmania, but they probably would do well here. But again, a lot of industries wouldn't like them. Tourism would be good for tourism, but then there's a lot of forestry in Tasmania. So a lot of tree clearing. The foresters wouldn't like it because the koalas would move in and say, yum, gum trees, and then they'd get cut down. So that would be a problem as well. So I don't think there's any, they'll be introduced into that the island of Tasmania. That's another state it's a bit like Hawaii. It's another state of Australia, but it is a separate island now. It was joined, of course, once by a land bridge when the sea levels were lower. And then if we go to
outside of human interests, I mean, are there issues with introducing koalas there where no fossils have been found? Like, would there be some potential like ecological consequences too?
Yeah, definitely. There would be. Well, there's a good example in New Zealand where possums were introduced, and that's exactly what's happened because possums are only native to Australia. They're not the same as the American opossums. These are different. And that's exactly what's happened. They've become a major pest in New Zealand because they eat all the leaves and defoliate all the trees. So yes, that would probably, although the koalas and possums are harmless, they don't go around killing anything, but they will eat everything. So you're quite right. I think that could be an issue in Tasmania as well. They could eat too many of the leaves, quite aside from competition with the foresters. And then what we see here in 2050 and 2070 is just that continual contraction of the koalas range. Although you will see that in Tasmania it becomes more dark because, what's going to happen is there'll be a southern contraction to go more towards Antarctica, of course, where the weather's cooler. So in your case, in North America, for instance, a lot of species are seen shifting northward to get to the cooler weather. But of course, we're on the other side of the equator. So here, our species are tending to shift southwards, where the weather continues to be cooler, where it will stay cooler. So that's why we see that they're disappearing from the north and hanging in the southern areas more. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in the future. Well, obviously, climate change is a whole big topic. We don't know what's going to happen there. But in terms of species, certainly, I'll go to the next slide. We know that koalas just can't survive without their forest first and foremost. We know that their habitat continues to shrink very rapidly, and we know that the main reasons, putting aside climate change, which is sort of sitting on top of everything, is agriculture and urban development, clearing. So, and really until we can replace their habitat or protect what they have left, really their habitat needs to be expanded and reconnected. So until that happens, the picture doesn't look good for koalas. Their habitats are becoming much more fragmented. They need big areas to be able to move, breed, and find those favourite trees. So one interesting thing is people will often say, I saw a koala, it walked into a forest. There were two of the same tree species. It walked up to one, sniffed, because their noses are very good. That's how they tend to pick up the chemicals in the leaves, and they can detect which ones have the better chemistry in terms of nutrients that the leaf offers. And they'll go past that tree and climb the one next to it, and they'll eat that one madly. And people will say, why? Why is the koala that fussy? But they are. They have to find the trees with the best leaves. So they need a big area so that they can find their favourite trees, all the trees they need for nutrition. So these gum trees are full of toxins, basically, the leaves. And, eucalyptus, as you know, you can buy eucalyptus oil and it'll clean really well. So they're trying to digest those toxins. And so they've really got to find the ones where there's a bit of a balance with some nitrogen, for instance, which will come through the leaves from better soils. But of course, the better soils is often where we've farmed as well. So there's all that competition. So it's very complex for koalas, and although they've been great at surviving through millions of years, in other ways they're just not coping with what we're throwing at them now. The other interesting thing to note is that some of those koala fossils were completely different species of koalas too. So they used to be part of a big family tree once, but now there's one surviving species, which is Phascolarctos cinereus, the one that everyone now sees. That's actually the last remaining member of once a large family tree.
Wow.
So once this one's gone, they're all gone. Like they'll just be in zoos and that'll be it. So it's very concerning. What can we do to save koalas? Well, it's really simple. They're not fussy animals in terms of their needs. They just need their food and they need their habitat. And obviously they need climate change to stop accelerating at this rate. So that's pretty much it from me in terms of the koalas in a nutshell, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Hi.
Hi. We don't have time to answer questions. Also, Christine was pre-recorded, so she's not actually backstage with us. But Christina had her own little Q&A, so hopefully that answered some of the questions you might have in the chat. We just want to say thank you, everyone, for tuning in tonight. A special thank you to David, Doug, and Christine for being part of our Down Under program. Next week, we are celebrating Pride Month with a special night school featuring scientists whose queer identities and perspectives help drive new insights, discoveries, and previously unasked questions in their respective fields. We're going to be featuring just a few of the people that will be featured in the Academy's new pop-up exhibit, New Science, which will be opening next week at Nightlife. So if you are able to go to Nightlife in person, you'll be one of the first to check it out.
And it will also be online. It's on the Academy's Google Arts and Culture page. So again, next week, we'll give you that link. Dr. Lauren Esposito, who you might have seen in previous episodes of Night School, will be talking about the exhibit. It's really an extension of her work on 500 queer scientists. So also, thank you, Sharon. Yeah, this is my last show for a while, till at least December. And so next week, Lynn will be joined by Aria, our new Night School host. So I think you'll really like her too. But thank you so much, everyone, for watching. And this has been such a joy over the past year. And don't forget to subscribe so you know when Night School's back. Recordings stay in our YouTube channel as long as YouTube is around. So if you missed anything, if you want to send this to a friend, please do. And also, yeah, that's it. I don't know what to say. I'll get emotional, but thank you so much for joining for yet another night. And Lynn, will see you next week.
Yeah, as Christina put it, which is how I'm coping with it too, is that this is just season 1 and season 2 is starting and Christina will be back. So thanks for being with the two of us for the last year plus. And I'll see you all next week.
Take care. Bye.